Boeing Starliner did not launch as scheduled on May 6th. And we got our first look at SpaceX's spacesuits. These are the spacesuits astronauts will wear on their first spacewalks from a crew vehicle since the space shuttle. That and more on this week's space news from Ad Astra. Welcome, I'm Swapna Krishna. Let's start with Boeing Starliner because that's on everyone's mind right now. The first crewed launch of Boeing's spacecraft was scheduled for Monday, May 6th, but it didn't happen. If you want a rundown on everything you need to know about this long delayed flight, check out my video. The flight was scrubbed about 2 hours before launch, even though everything seemed to be going really smoothly. The team was even ahead of schedule and they were going to close the hatch early, but an oscillating valve meant that the launch just wasn't going to happen. The problem was that there's a pressure valve for liquid oxygen on the second stage of the rocket. The rocket is an Atlas V from ULA or United Launch Alliance. ULA has seen issues before where this valve can get just off its seat and then it'll flutter and cycle. That's exactly what happened here. They determined though that because of the way this valve opened and closed and the number of times it did that, it was past its rated limits and it needs to be replaced. There was no real danger to the crew here, and this really is just a flight rule thing, but because it's a crewed launch and they aren't taking any chances, they're rolling the rocket back to the vertical integration building to replace this valve. That means that they are now targeting Friday, May 17th for this launch. While the jokes about this delay really do right themselves at this point, I am glad they're doing the responsible thing here and prioritizing the well-being of the crew over schedule. Once Starliner launches, the next major U.S. crewed launch will be Polaris Dawn, which is a private spaceflight mission on a SpaceX Crew Dragon. I know private spaceflight doesn't interest a lot of people, and I understand why, but I think Polaris Dawn is something people will want to pay attention to. That's why I'm covering it alongside regular NASA missions. Basically, if the Hubble Space Telescope gets a boost and a servicing mission, the Polaris program will be what accomplishes that. Polaris will consist of 3 missions total. The aim is to culminate in the first crewed flight of SpaceX's Starship, and they're currently targeting this first mission, Polaris Dawn, for an early summer launch. The mission will fly into high Earth orbit, higher than any human has flown since Apollo. Polaris Dawn will be the first private spaceflight to perform an EVA or a spacewalk. Right now, we only have spacewalking capability from the ISS, not from a crew vehicle. And it's possible Polaris Dawn will change that. This week, we got a look at SpaceX's Polaris Dawn spacesuits. The suit is focused on mobility because the crew will be wearing a single suit all the way from launch through splashdown. When they're unpressurized, when the crew's in the capsule, they remain soft and flexible. When the suit is pressurized prior to and during an EVA, they become rigid to protect the wearer from the hazards of space. The designers also paid a lot of attention to thermal management. The suit has an integrated cooling system that the astronauts will be able to turn on as needed. They will also have a heads-up display in their helmet that will show them current suit conditions. I will have a rundown of the Polaris Dawn mission, including the changes that were made to the Crew Dragon capsule to accommodate an EVA closer to the launch date. A big piece of space news recently was about problems with the heat shield on the Orion capsule. Orion is the crew vehicle for the Artemis program, and it is supposed to take humans back to the moon and establish a sustained presence there. The next launch, which will be the first crewed launch of the Artemis program, is currently scheduled for September 2025, and then the first moon landing would be 2026, though these are pretty ambitious dates. NASA has to get this heat shield issue sorted before Artemis 2, as a new report from the NASA Office of the Inspector General makes clear. However, it's a complicated problem that they are still figuring out. What happened was, on Artemis 1, the heat shield behaved differently than they expected. The material was liberated in chunks rather than ablating or melting off as they expected. I dived into the whole issue in a separate video because there's a lot to cover here, so check that out if you're interested. In news about our sun, the ESA Solar Orbiter captured an incredible view of the sun's surface. This view was recorded in extreme ultraviolet light, and at the time this was recorded, the orbiter was about 30 million miles or 48 million kilometers away from the sun. That's about a third of the distance from the Earth to the sun. For reference, this is just a little closer than Mercury orbits our sun. This video takes us up from the sun's lower atmosphere to its much hotter outer atmosphere, the corona. We still don't really know why the sun's corona is hotter than its visible surface. You can see structures on the sun's visible surface that make it look fuzzy. This is charged gas or plasma that's connected to magnetic field lines within the interior of the sun. In the lower left corner, there's what's called coronal moss. This is probably the base of a coronal loop that's too hot to be seen by the orbiter's settings at the time it took this video. The bumps you can see on the horizon of the sun are called spicules, and they're from the chromosphere. They can be 10,000 kilometers or about 6,200 miles high. The eruption here is larger than Earth. You can also see coronal rain that's darker than what's around it because it's cooler. The brightest spots are hotter, around 1 million degrees Celsius or 1.8 million degrees Fahrenheit, while the darker spots are cooler, relatively speaking, of course. The rain is made of high-density plasma that falls back onto the sun. Now here's some great news. NASA's TESS spacecraft, its exoplanet hunter, is back in action after going into safe mode on April 18th. TESS, or the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite, uses the transit method to identify exoplanet candidates. It looks for tiny dips in starlight that could be an exoplanet passing in front of a star from our perspective. What happened was that momentum built up in TESS's reaction wheels. These are how the spacecraft properly orients itself. The spacecraft failed to unload that momentum. After investigating, the team determined that the propulsion system, which is what is responsible for allowing this routine momentum transfer to happen, hadn't been fully repressurized following a stint in safe mode earlier in April. They repressurized the system, and TESS was back in operation as of May 3rd. It's great news, but it is still a little concerning that the team still doesn't know what sent the spacecraft into safe mode in the first place. TESS was in safe mode from April 11th to April 17th, and we're still trying to figure out why that happened. But for now, it's good to know that TESS is back on the hunt for exoplanet candidates. In kind of wild news, what would it be like to fall into a black hole? NASA released a video this week on YouTube explaining this, and it's really cool. I'm showing some of the video here, but I'm also going to link to it because it's worth watching on its own for the full experience. The video was produced on a NASA supercomputer, and it's available in 360-degree video. What this is showing us is a simulation of a camera as it approaches, orbits, and then crosses the event horizon, or the point of no return, of a black hole. There's also a second video of what it would be like as a camera approached and then managed to escape a black hole. That's also worth watching. And that is just about all the news I have for you this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Swapna Krishna, and this is Ad Astra.